Good afternoon, everyone. We are absolutely delighted to be welcoming you today to this special webinar that we're holding to mark the 100th anniversary and commemoration of Women's Equality Day in the US. I'm just letting people join the webinar. We know that we need a couple of seconds for participants to be able to join, so please bear with us as we're slow right now. And while we do that, I'm going to start with some housekeeping announcements. We have a Q&A function, so please do, by all means, I really encourage you. We have some amazing speakers today, so I really encourage you to engage fully with the Q&A function. Please use that to put your questions to both Marjorie Krause and Irene Khan, and also use the chat function, which is open. We're all able to see it, and we really want to make sure that this is as much of an interactive conversation as we can have in these days of physical distancing. So with those points of housekeeping out of the way, I am really delighted to be welcoming the two women for whom I've worked for the last 20 years. I have been in an unbelievably privileged position of having two fantastic women whose lists of women's firsts are just too long for me to go into. I have really lived through this, every aspect of this important point that we hear about why having strong women mentors and strong women leaders is really critical to helping other women grow in their careers. And I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Marjorie Krause, the founder and executive chairman of APCO Worldwide and my current boss, and Irene Khan, my former boss, for whom I've worked when she was Secretary General of Amnesty International, the world's largest human rights organization, when she headed the International Development Law Organization, the only multilateral that focused on the rule of law, and now in her new capacity as UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression and Opinion. Irene, you were actually the first woman to hold all of those three positions, so we're delighted to have you here with us today. As I mentioned, it's particularly important for us to be holding this conversation today as we're marking Women's Equality Day. For those of you who are not familiar with what this means, we have a very handy little digital display for you in the next slide that outlines the fact that we are marking the constitutional amendment that granted women the right to vote. However, as we're seeing, race and ethnicity actually play a massive impact in women having the ability to exercise their full rights. And indeed, it wasn't until 1984 that Mississippi actually ratified the 19th Amendment. So it tells you how much and how long this gap exists between law turning into equality. We also see, and we know that this notion of the whole issue around the gaps between equality in law and practice are huge. In the next slide, we have an overview of what the World Bank maps out of the countries in where you see that women do not have equal rights as men on paper. Overall, very few countries actually guarantee legal equality, and women have just 3/4 of the legal rights of men. So we do have a sobering reality and a sobering panel, but on the other hand, we have huge excitement and I think opportunity when you have women like Marjorie and Irene who are able to really rise to the top. So without further ado, and because I know that you all really want to listen to Marjorie and Irene and not me, I'm going to just ask Killian to just turn down the screen so that we can focus on our speakers and really turn Marjorie to you first and ask you about what do you see in this very complex environment that we're living now as the biggest barrier for women's equality?
Well, I think it's maybe perception. In a way, our biggest opportunity, our biggest hindrance, or maybe the perception of men and some women. I think that we've come a long way, but I think that there's always a double standard that's applied. We see it in our election season right now. When women are tough, it seems to be a negative, and but when men are tough, it seems to be a positive. And so I think a lot of this is just, you know, how do you, this comes from within. So I know Irene has spent a lifetime talking about how you create the frameworks and the legal requirements to make people more equal. But I still think that even if we have all of that, and your map was all dark blue, which, you know, maybe someday it will be, I think we still have to deal with these prejudices that people hold just based on, some out of fear, they don't want women to take over certain things, some out of ignorance. And so we have to celebrate those men that support us, and the societies that that recognize that, you know, women do represent kind of half the sky and half the opportunity. And, you know, it can significantly, when there's men and women that are working side by side, we raise the GDP, we do a lot of things. It's all now very statistically proven. But I think we still have a long way to go. And I just wanted to note one other thing, and that is, this isn't the only day we celebrated. And I just wanted to, for the APCO people on the phone, earlier this year on March 4th, we had a special day on Capitol Hill, which was a huge and uplifting success. And we looked back over the last 100 years, and we partnered with the Close-Up Foundation, American University, and we hosted something called Century of Progress. And it was a reminder that even though we have a long way to go, how far we have come. And I think that it's really a great thing. So if you think of this as a journey like you were on your map, we have, unfortunately, another 100 years that people are saying it's going to take till we're equal. But at the same time, we can look back over the last 100 years and say we've made some progress. And so I think we, you know, I think working together, we have a ways to go, but I think we can take today and just celebrate what we have. And just one last thing is that, and I've mentioned this before, I know Judith has heard this, but whenever I think about the men and women working together, working side by side, and I think we definitely will see this in terms of all of the feedback from COVID and the fact that women have taken on new jobs. You know, aside from your day job, you now have your housekeeping job back, and you have, you know, your babysitting job and your tutor job, and, you know, balancing all of this. And we should definitely talk about that for a while today, because some of the people watching may have some ideas themselves about how you balance all of this thing. I'm always harkened back to Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, who are much older than the average demographic on this call, but Fred Astaire was a well-renowned dancer, and people used to comment about his grace and poise and all of that. And Ginger Rogers was his partner, and made him even more graceful and more poised. And then we have to remember that everything he did, and as great as he was, she did everything backwards and in high heels. And so I think that's symbolic in a lot of ways for the way women have to operate. We have to do everything. We have to be capable of doing everything that we see men do, but a lot of times we end up doing it with an extra degree of difficulty because we have other responsibilities. So I'm going to leave it there for now. And Irene, I look forward to talking to you as much as talking to the audience. You know, I'm a great admirer, and we share our affection for Judith. So I'm so glad to see you and to continue to learn from you.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. Irene, thank you so much for joining us from Geneva. So I think now maybe a different perspective from the other side of the world, from Washington, DC. Let's go to Europe and hear from you in terms of, you've obviously been working in this space for a long time as well as has Marjorie, and we'd love to hear your take on the challenges and barriers that you think women face now.
Well, first of all, I want to thank APCO and Marjorie for giving me this opportunity to join you on this day. It's a very auspicious day. And as Marjorie, you mentioned, you know, looking back 100 years. If I look back 100 years, you know, my grandmother was 3 years old in 1920. And she got married at the age of 13. She had her first child when she was 15. My mother, who was born in 1935, got married at the age of 15. She had a high school diploma, and that was it. And then she had 3 girls. And she was determined that her girls would have the opportunity that she didn't have. And you mentioned men. My father actually supported her because he believed in the agency of women. He believed in the education of girls. And I was fortunate enough to go to Harvard Law School. You know, with a mother with a high school diploma, a grandmother who could just write her name. She could only.
Well, Irene froze.
Yeah, I think we're having
moment,
some technical.
But we'll hear the rest of that story because that's incredible. And I certainly identify with it because
for all of us. And you know, when we talk about women, it's as though we are all the same. But when I look at the Zoom screen in front of me, I see you, Marjorie, but I see Judith, who comes from Mexico. I see myself coming from Asia. Women have different experiences. There are women of color, there are ethnic, religious issues, there is class, a level of education, all sorts of things. So if we need to kind of look at the intersection, what the technical term is intersectionality, you know, how all these various factors intersect and measure progress also with that sensitivity. You were saying, Judith, you know, what holds us back now? I think what's holding us back is the failure to appreciate the importance of bringing political power that women are increasingly having together with economic power. You know, it's we have the vote. My mother was able to vote at the age of 18 or 20, I think 21 in those days. But she was married at the age of 15 and had a high school diploma. And so could never actually get the economic empowerment that she would have liked. So I think bringing those two things together, women now are getting into parliament, but worldwide, only 23% of parliamentarians are women. The highest, interestingly enough, is in Rwanda, where it is 63%, and the lowest is in the Middle East, where it's around, average is about 16%. But what happens in these parliaments? What kinds of laws and policies are made? Marjorie, you mentioned the burden that women have at home while they're carrying out their work. And I know that APCO has been absolutely, has taken a leadership position on issues like maternity leave, for example, childcare arrangements and so on. And so those are the kinds of issues that often make a difference between whether women are truly empowered and genuinely whether we are making progress on equality between men and women, as well as, of course, the ballot.
Well,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too because you know, part of the reason I think we have the programs we do is, you know, one's own experience. As you said, everybody is different. And I came from, you know, I'm first generation. My mother had to flee twice, first from Poland, then from Cuba. And she never had a chance to, you know, to increase her education. And it was just the same, you know, my mother and father were very generous in supporting, you know, and pushing us to make the most of ourselves. And so I think, you know, having built this company and built your profession while raising kids and, you know, and trying to support yourself and all of that, you know, just makes you realize that if there's a way you can play it forward and you can help other women, and you can create an environment where men and women can work side by side and do good work, then you know that you could be, that you should do that. You have an obligation to do that. And so hopefully by example, we can do that.
Thank you. I'm actually struggling to capture notes as well because you're both giving us really just very, very smart words of guidance. I want to pick up on this role about women's different role, this question of women's different roles that you've both alluded to, because you have both headed organizations. You've been in that driving seat where you have to manage large number and large groups of people. What do you think are those kind of key lessons that other managers, particularly emerging ones, can learn from that, and bearing in mind that women have different roles. You have both been mothers, you've had to be carers for relatives. The demands on women are actually quite high.
Irene, do you want to go first this time?
Well, Marjorie, you actually have a double advantage on me because you have children, but you also have grandchildren.
Nine of them. My first grandchild just finished college during COVID, so she didn't she didn't have an official graduation, but very proud of her.
So how you've managed that, I've always wondered. I think it's difficult. It's very difficult because it's not just about what we do as individuals. It's also the policy environment. What kind of support do laws and policies provide? And in countries where actually women have policy support, have access. I'll use one example. I've written a lot on poverty. If I look at a place like India or Tanzania, they have found that when women own their own land and farm that land, then their productivity, the land productivity goes up and their income goes up about 3 or 4 times. So being able to have the resources enables you to then manage your life, because that's what it's all about. Your choices come from your ability to have the resources. And that's where I think what we find is when we look at employment, of course, more women are in the labor market now and so on, but we see very often women at the lower levels of the employment market. And so they're hurt very fast. And they aren't able, unlike some fortunate ones like myself, they aren't able to provide, to have childcare. I went out to work, but I earned enough to be able to provide childcare for my daughter. So those issues, and that is where I think perhaps this may sound strange in the US context, but living in Europe, living in other countries, of course, I've seen what difference it's made when women have social protection. And that sort of empowers them. So as we go forward, I think we as women need to champion those policies that enable women, actually enabling policies on social protection. Because when you have budget cuts, very often, if you cut the health budget, who suffers most? Women and children. And very often, social services and others, those kinds of issues just don't get the attention. It's security that gets the attention. So governments are more willing to buy arms and weapons than invest in childcare and so on. And I think COVID-19 has exposed the problem clearly as what is really important in our lives. And we've suddenly discovered that what's really important is healthcare, it's food security, and so on. But at the same time, because of all the social distancing, the problems of the virus and so on, it also means that women's work has doubled. And there's been some retrogression. And many of the girls who've dropped out of school may never go back to school again in many countries of the world. Many of the women who've lost their jobs, particularly in the lower levels, may never get those jobs because the hospitality industry, for example, will change. The care industry will also change and so on. So the impact of what is happening on women right now is very significant. And that makes this kind of discussion doubly so. So how do we manage our life-work balance? Of course, there is a personal psychological aspect to it, but there is also a resource aspect to it too, and education. If you're educated, you can get a better job, you can have more resources. So there's a whole kind of social, a number of social issues behind how we manage social and political issues, because it's also about state policies, government policies, about how we manage our work-life balance.
Well, this discussion takes place at a really interesting time, particularly in the United States with elections coming up. Because I think what COVID also did was 2 things, and maybe they're at cross currents in some ways. I think that it has shown a light, I think, on the value of a lot of the things that women do that over the years have never been thought of in terms of economic value. What is the value of being able to teach at home? What is the value of keeping up the house? What is the value doing some of these other things that are just expected, but maybe never valued. And so I think there is a lot of discussion around that. But at the same time, as we look around and we see all the frontline workers and we see how many women really have carried through during COVID, and there have been a lot of, and this isn't disparaging about men because certainly they have as well, but the number of women who have been on the front lines, whether it's grocery clerks or whether it's, hospital workers, nurses, it's been a tremendous eye-opener to think about how much we rely in our society. And then I have to apologize that there's a buzzing going on here. That's me. They're constructing under me right now. I was hoping they would stop for this time. But I think the other part of that is that, we're also advancing a lot of technology. And when you look at the impact of that technology, it also will be, the jobs that will be eliminated will disproportionately impact women, and not because there's discrimination, but just the nature of those jobs. So we have to really take action in our society to figure out what we value. And this goes back, Irene, to what you were saying, and this maybe has given us all a chance to think about this. And we have to think about, what we do to actually protect women in this situation, and then what we do going forward to advance women. And that's everything from really, I think Europe is way ahead on childcare and on daycare and certain things that in our country seem to be, much more an individual responsibility and less a state responsibility. And yet those are the most formative years for those kids. And if the parents aren't freed up in some way to advance themselves, you lose a lot of that work equity that you can build on to advance yourself. So we have all these choices we have to make. And that's why I love the idea of stepping back today and saying, where are we exactly? What can we celebrate? But really, what is the journey ahead? And for all the younger women who are watching and men, because we need both, there's so much that I think people take for granted until it's gone. And I think as we think about these choices we make going forward and as to what's important, I think we have to really make sure that we protect the things that I know my generation spent a lifetime trying to achieve, to advance women in positions of political power, to advance a woman's control over her life, even doing a lot of work in the Middle East this year. I know how many of the women we were working with in Saudi, these fantastic women, had advanced and were incredible, but still there was a guardianship that until the Crown Prince took that away this year, they still were very restricted in what they could do without permission. And I think that whole idea, even if it wasn't followed through by everybody, of knowing that you don't have to rely on somebody else, just frees up a way you can think about the future that's very healthy and that maybe will help us advance some of these areas.
I'm going to start moving into some of the questions because I think you're prompting a lot of the comments and a lot of the questions that are coming through. The question of technology came up just a second ago in terms of how technology can be helpful. But on the other hand, those jobs, particularly at the bottom of the pyramid that are performed by women, are most likely to be the ones that are going to take away sources of employment. But there's also another dimension. We're already hearing and seeing examples of where, for instance, artificial intelligence can be biased and biased against women. So I wanted to just delve into that. And Irene, also looking at your new role, is going to have to look a lot about how technology can potentially impact on speech. So would love your take about, this notion of bias. We all know about inherent bias. We know that we have to counteract it, but where do we step in where technology is likely to have a negative impact?
Well, technology, of course, brings a lot of good and has improved lives enormously across the board around the world. But technology also, of course, has a dark side to it. When it comes to women, what it shows as economies become more sophisticated and technology is used more in the economy, you need to invest more in women. So you need to invest more in women. You need to look at life. If we have more, what do we do with our time? It's not just to create more unemployed women, but how can we look at a different economy? And I'm not an economist, but one of the things that I have read and it struck me is if we were actually to give a value, an economic value to the work, the number of hours that women spend, for example, at home, taking care of children, unpaid household work, if you counted that, if you paid someone to do that work, how much would it count? You would have a very different GDP. You would have a very different national budget. The whole way in which you look at things would change. So this is why I'm actually very interested and very inspired by the fact that I see now men who describe themselves as feminists. So feminism doesn't have to do anything with your biological sex. It actually has to do more with your frame of mind and the way you look at things. So I think we will need, and technology forces us to look at things very, very differently. The other point, I'll give you one very concrete example of how technology has advanced, but also how there needs to be a gender perspective to technology. I come from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is very advanced in mobile technology and has used Bcash, which is basically you use your mobile phone to carry out financial transactions. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who are doing that now, people with very low education in very simple ways. And one of the NGOs on whose board I sit, non-profit organizations on whose board I sit in Bangladesh, has a huge program on making these facilities available to poor people, rural areas, remote areas, and so on. But when we analyzed that program, we found that there were very few women who were using this service. And so we started digging deeper. And we discovered that when you use your mobile phone, of course, you have to top up your mobile phone, if you want to use it for these services and transfer money and so on. The topping up is usually done at tea stalls on the highway. Women, Bangladesh is still a fairly conservative Muslim society. Women don't go to tea stalls, and they don't trust their husbands or their brothers or their fathers with financial matters for obvious reasons in a country like that. So women were not using that mobile technology. There was nothing wrong with the technology itself. The technology itself was not biased, but there was a social factor there. But sometimes the technology itself is also biased. We found that as well with the algorithms and other things. So there needs to be much greater sensitivity for those who are creating these systems now to think about women, but there needs to be more women in the tech sector. That's another problem. There are not enough women in the tech sector. And that is why some things that we women almost think naturally may not occur to men. So yes, technology is a challenge, and technology, of course, can create prejudice, bias, discrimination, but it can also open up opportunities, providing there is the diversity. So we come back to human diversity, even in a very technologically advanced society. At the end, the human diversity matters. And and I would also say not just women in general, but the different kinds of women that you have. That's also important because the cultural aspect is very important. I just showed you with the example of Bangladesh.
Marjorie, do you have anything that you want to add? Especially, I want to delve as well also on the fact that you work a lot with women entrepreneurs. You actually also see that kind of like cutting edge where women are both starting and leading their own businesses.
Yeah, I'd like to say a couple things. That's the Women Presidents Organization, WPO, which is an unbelievable organization, 2,000 women who own their own businesses and who rely on this. And a lot of them are businesses relating to technology. So I think technology, for the women who have chosen that route is a great new area because it's still an open field, and if you do well, if that's your aptitude, I think there's a lot of opportunities. And my granddaughter, that my oldest one just graduated, is math and computer science, so that's great. I think, you know, technology is interesting. And what you said before about AI and the bias, you know, AI is going to be probably have the biggest impact on all of us over the next, I don't know how many, but at least the next decade. And we don't know exactly where this would go. And so much of it we don't even realize because it just is happening automatically. And it's all been accelerated by COVID. But, you know, just like on women's health for years, most of the studies were carried out on men, and then the medicines were used and prescribed equally as if men and women had the same bodies or the same capacity to absorb drugs, or they would have the same impact. And it's only been recently that groups have really paid attention to making sure that these clinical trials include women, so that the impact can be seen on women. I think the same thing is happening in AI. I think a lot of the ways in which, because it's mostly men creating it, because that's the way the field has been, I think we have to be really careful to pay attention to this right now, because we don't want so much of our society, which will be dependent on AI, to be dependent on AI that's created based on male responses to things. It should be equal. It should be, there should be a way with sophisticated technology to make sure that men and women can be, have the same impact. And there are all kinds of things like this that I think we don't even think about it. They're just happening, and they're happening fast. And you know, on the other hand, technology, as I said, is a great elevator. There's this group that has been doing, helping young women in the inner cities learn how to code. And that is almost a guarantee that even if they don't go to college, that they're going to have jobs that are higher paying. And so I think this whole skills-based education is another area where women can excel. We tend to focus everything on resumes and where did you go to school and what did you learn? And now there's a whole movement, which I applaud, that looks at the skills base, because it opens up so many jobs to people who may not have the same level of education. And that actually was one of the reasons I wrote this book on 10 lessons from motherhood that helped me run my business. I was trying to make a point that there's a lot of things that women bring to the party that have not been formalized into the way society values things. You know, can women perform this job if they haven't had this education? Can women be leaders, or is there some inherent way women lead that's different than the way men led before? You know, when I started APCO, we've always been an organization that's not really been a top-down dictatorship. We've always been a much more collaborative organization. The first 5 years of APCO, we had some very senior people, former ambassadors, members of Congress, or whatever, in the company, who spent all their time telling me how I didn't know how, what I was doing wrong, because they said, you got to be decisive and you got to force these, plans forward. And now we're finding out that a lot of what women inherently do, by the way they bring people together and by some of their, EQ skills, actually are better ways to run a company or run society. So, I think it's a question of, again, just making sure that we're careful about what we value and about whether we have to keep an eye on these kind of inherent prejudices or just biases that just are natural, and pay attention to make sure that we intervene in a way that's helpful for the future.
Thank you. I'm loving the chat because we're seeing some really great examples and some really amazing comments from people that, and including women, who have really been at the forefront of some of these movements that push forward change. And I want to just address one question coming from Nomza, who headed the Graça Machel Foundation, that if there's someone that knows about really promoting women's leadership, Nomza, you really are one of the people who have done this. And I hope that we can actually get you to actually speak and share some of this. But Nomsa's actually asking about, can you provide examples of women coming together to amplify their economic or political power, and what can be done to encourage some more of these types of collaborations?
Well, I think Nomsa is a good example of that when we worked on Women Advancing Africa together, because she was certainly at the forefront of bringing these women together. And it's one of my great memories of work is that, we had I know she'll remember this, but there was a question about why there aren't indigenous pharmaceuticals in Africa, why there's no place to build them. And one of the women said, well, you need agricultural projects. Another woman said, well, I'm a farmer, I can do that. Why don't we get together? But it was just such a good example of solving the mentality of solving problems. And I think there are a lot of examples of this. I think certainly, what we've seen about women coming together, as I said before, like a WPO, where the whole mission is to share experiences so that you can elevate other women's businesses based on what you've learned, and they can elevate you. I think another way women have come together is through buying power and through agreeing, forming consortiums or working together to, I don't want to say to boycott, but to make some products better. And then, I think and then politically, I think women will play a huge role in the upcoming elections. And it's not that women will all feel one way or the other, but I think it's fair to say that the outcome of the election will be determined by the turnout of women. And we don't always realize that we have as much control of the future as we could if we got together. And I think Nomsa's question, she has seen this firsthand, especially working with somebody like Rasha Michelle. But I'm sure that she has other examples, and I'm sure that Irene, you've seen a lot of this.
Yes, no, this is a very interesting question, and I was listening, as I was listening to you, Marjorie, I was remembering that if you look at India, the cooperative movement in India, SEVA, which is one of the largest cooperative movements in the world, is about bringing women together in small cooperatives across the country, and helping, women coming together and helping themselves lift themselves out of poverty. The whole microcredit concept was and is about helping women, because most women could not get loans from banks because they have no collateral, and the loans that they were asking for are usually asked for are just too small. But I have seen how microcredit done properly have actually helped a woman go from owning a cow and a couple of chickens to owning a small shop, to moving up to create a little factory. And in Bangladesh, in my country, there are hundreds and thousands of women who have lifted themselves out of poverty, working together in small groups. So there are so many wonderful stories about how women actually help, and women-led businesses and women entrepreneurs and others. The changes that they have brought is just amazing. All they need is an enabling environment, and the women coming together. If you look at women's emancipation, we were talking about the vote earlier. How did that happen? A group of women came together. It was the women's movement that actually, women's movements around the world, all the rights that women have usually got have been as a result of women's collective movement. So women coming together is very powerful, from #MeToo, going back and looking at the suffragettes and so on. So this is actually a secret ingredient, I think, that we don't think about enough. But it's there for us to explore. That does not mean excluding men, because as I said, more and more men are becoming feminists. And that's a state of mind.
And thank you, because you're actually bringing up one of the points around the Me Too movement. And we have a question from Nancy Tourette, who has a lot of experience actually also working in the global public health space, who would love to hear the thoughts the panel may have about the Me Too movement. When is it constructive? When does it potentially go too far in positioning women as unempowered victims? And I think that's a very interesting reflection. Thank you for that question, Nancy.
I think it's a very interesting question. And, you know, I think anybody who, at least in my generation, had a Me Too moment. I mean, you just didn't work as a young woman and not have some very serious issues, and some of them went farther than others. So the whole idea that you can now talk about this, that people take it seriously, and that it is an appropriate thing to ban in the workplace, I think is all to the good. I think what happens though is when, and I think that a lot of these examples that were out there were so obvious that I don't think they disempower women. I think the women finally stood up and said enough is enough, and that if we're going to have these workplaces that are healthy, then we have to respect each other. However, you know, the downside of that is where do you draw the line? And I think that you have to use judgment on these things. Otherwise, it cheapens how serious the serious things are. And I think you can't be so sensitive that you make people afraid to even work with you. One of the bigger banks, one of their vice chairmen, who's a real advocate for women, was telling me that during this whole thing, he didn't want to even take a woman to dinner for business or anything like that, because he was just so concerned that it would be turned into something, and for his own protection, you know, he travel. I mean, there are just so many things that you know, men then have to balance, and you don't ever want it to be something that holds back what could be a good relationship or could be a good professional relationship. And so I think there's a fine line in this to where, and that this is really up to the women. You know, if women want to use this as an excuse and complain about things that are, I'd say, relatively minor, but that's a judgment call, because what's relatively minor to me may really have offended somebody else. So there's no right or wrong answer to this other than good judgment, and to really focus on the things that need to change, and then the things that should change will change. You know, it's a hierarchy, I think, of things, but being conscious about it is important.
I think violence against women and girls is probably one of the main barriers to women's progress, if you look globally at the situation, and it's still very serious. According to World Health Organization, according to UN Women and organizations that have a global perspective, 1 in 3 women will become a victim of sexual and gender-based violence in her lifetime. That's a large number. If you look at this screen now, between the 3 of us, you know, that's 1/3. And there is a lot of work that has been done. The main issue there is also empowering women themselves to deal with the situation. And I think that's what, as Marjorie, you mentioned, that's what #MeToo has done, is get women to talk about it and get others to recognize that this is a problem and has to be addressed. I think it's very, very important to understand the cultural nuances. And I don't only mean cultures as different ethnic groups or communities. I also mean the culture in the office and the organization, to have open culture so that people can discuss and understand and set shared values. So, you know, how you treat each other. I mean, I have spent most of my working life in international organizations, in international settings, where what is acceptable by one woman or what is considered by a man to be polite or impolite or transgressing, you know, the norms, it depended very often on where they came from, which country, which region. So it was so important to get people together, men and women, to talk about each other's values so that you understand. I mean, you know, I might not feel uncomfortable about a man putting his hand, for example, on my shoulder when he's talking to me about something, but I can imagine a lot of other women would be horrified in Switzerland and in France, as you know, they don't shake hands. They'll kiss you on the cheek. Some women would find that pretty offensive. But for the men, it's okay. In Italy, you constantly compliment a woman on how she's dressed in a way in which in the US, you would have huge problems if that happened. So I think it's very important to also talk about it in the offices, to create an open environment where people can talk about these things and feel comfortable. There's comfortable space where these issues come up. So as you said, Marjorie, there are no hard and fast rules here. It's about working it out, because at the end of the day, it's about human relations.
Well, I'm so glad you raised the global nature of this, because there definitely are different standards. And I could tell a lot of stories about this, but one of the other things is that at APCO, there are 5 generations of people in the company. So it's not just where you live in the world, it's also what your experience has been. And some of the people who are more my age grew up with a very different set of norms than some of the younger men at APCO. And it's not whether they mean ill or they don't mean ill. It's just that, complimenting a woman or putting your arm around them was a way of life. Which isn't as acceptable today. And so I do think that's where I say you really have to use judgment, and you have to understand intent. And slowly, I think that this will be, I honestly believe this will be less of a problem.
I'd love to pick up on the cultural norms that was mentioned just now, because I think we're really talking as well about these whole issues about the environment in which women operate and women are faced. And Dr. Barbara Hutchinson, who is a leading medical figure, has actually asked the panel about precisely this issue. How can we actually help women where there's still a culture where the men sees the women's role as being in the home, where women may actually be going out to work, be earning perfectly good salaries and in positions of power, yet when they get home, there's no help. But how can this be changed, and what's the best way of educating men? And I think bringing up the question of the role of men as allies. Both of you know Malala Yousaf. You've both had the opportunity to work with this extraordinary Pakistani girl. And I think, part of the hidden story behind Malala is actually the secret weapon of her dad, who really encouraged her. So I'd love to talk about this issue about norms and men in this space.
Yes, well, I come from a society where a lot of women are treated like that. And I think it's extremely important what we do as mothers. How do we bring up our sons? Every man has had a mother. And I see younger men are much more sensitive about gender equality, much more willing, for example, to help their wives or partners in taking care of domestic work or children and so on. And part of it is because they've had working mothers. And they have seen how their mothers manage things. Sometimes the husbands helped and sometimes didn't, but the young boy, growing up boy, understood, and the mother also made him realize that men have to share these responsibilities. So there is a very important role that women have to play in how you educate your sons. And then, of course, men themselves are also, who have partners and so on. If my father, for example, I think having daughters made him realize how important it was to make sure that his daughters had the education to be able to stand on their own feet and be independent and take care of themselves so that they would not be exploited by others. I remember when I was in Amnesty, Judith, you will remember, we launched the first global campaign to stop violence against women. And one of the symbols of that is that you would dip your hand on paint and you would put it on a big blank canvas. And I remember that in Australia, when we had that, and we just brought out the canvas and we said, okay, now we'll do this. Before anyone else could dip their hand on the paint, a young man came running onto the stage, put his hand in, put it on the canvas, and he said, "For my mother," because his mother had been a victim of violence. So, it's in that kind of a situation there, I think a lot of men are beginning to realize that it is the right thing, it's the wise thing, but it's also the just thing to do. And then, of course, again, I come back as a lawyer, of course, to laws and policies and, the state and government and communities, how they organize themselves. And that's where there are a lot of prejudices still there. If you're talking about these kind of cultures, the community has a huge role to play, community leaders, religious leaders, and they also need to be pushed And some of them are moving forward and others are going a bit more slowly and may need to be prodded by some women and men.
Yeah, I think there's much more consciousness now on the part of men. And I mean, I think watching men and women work side by side, at least my experience has been that there's a lot of mutual respect. And I'm so excited for the next generation because I don't think they see the differences. I don't, you know, they've had the experience of having women, men have had the experience of having women as bosses, and vice versa. And I don't think people think about it the same way. Whereas it was unusual as I was coming of age professionally for any woman to like be in charge of a group of men, or you know, and so I think just those attitudes change. And I totally agree with you, Irene, that all these men have mothers, and you know, it's been very interesting in reverse. All these women have fathers, and I know over the years that some of the men that I have found in some ways the most difficult to deal with, when their daughters start growing up, you start to get phone calls. Would you mind mentoring my daughter? Or would you mind, you know, they're horrified at some of the stories their daughters have brought home. And I think that's also caused a change of behavior because I think these men appreciate these very bright women that they have birthed with their wives. And I think they want to see a future. And so I do think some of the people who have made the biggest difference in my life as advocates have been men, you know, and I think that that's why, I mean, I'm very optimistic about the future. I think there are now enough men in corporations that, or at least I won't say enough, but there are a lot who see this issue as very important to them. And who will stand up and try to encourage others. I was in a very interesting panel in Davos last year, and you know, IKEA is one of those companies where the CEO has been, you know, very proud of a 50-50 relationship, men and women in management, and really has taken a lot of pride. And there were some other men in the group who were really struggling, not because they didn't want to, because they might have been in the tech field or they might have been somewhere else. And they really were trying to figure out how do you encourage an atmosphere? How do you make that change? Because until there's a tipping point and you have enough women that it changes the culture, it's hard to recruit in and keep those women. And so you know, and I think you know, every generation has its pioneers, and I think we need to encourage women to kind of see that through and try to bring others along. But it's a journey, as we said before. It's not just something that will happen, and you know, I hope it's not another 100 years. That's more on equal pay, but I really hope that we can move a lot faster. But I am very optimistic about these young men that I see.
Yes, I think there's also an economic issue here, a cost issue. You know, 16% of the global GDP is lost because of gender discrimination. If you don't, because women are a resource. So if you are, you know, 50% of your country's resource. So if you're not educating women, if you're not letting them have equal chance, imagine the talent that countries and societies are losing. So there is a very strong economic argument as well for those who are not necessarily convinced by the social argument or the moral argument. There is also an economic argument there.
Well, look at Japan right now. I mean, you know, the Abe government has been very vocal and active in getting more women engaged, and that's because the GDP was not growing, and you know, there was one place to find highly qualified labor force.
So this has been a fascinating discussion, but we are getting to time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's availability. So I'm going to just ask you one last question before I turn to just some round up comments that have come in from the audience that I think will set the scene for closing. But as final words, I'd love to hear, what would you tell your younger self now? You know, you've broken glass ceilings, you've achieved so many things that are incredibly inspiring. If you had to go back and be young in today's day and age, what would be that one piece of advice that you would give yourself?
I'm happy to go first on this because, you know, I think the one thing I realized as I got older is to be less apologetic about being a woman. I guess that's the best way to say it. And to have that level of confidence in yourself that you can stand up and feel good and call things out when they need to be called out, instead of suffering in silence when you're in a meeting and you say something that you think is pretty smart. Nobody acknowledges it, and 2 minutes later a guy says it and they say, "Oh, what a great idea." You know, I make a joke of it now. I mean, I think that I've learned that if you don't speak up for yourself, nobody's going to speak up for you. And I've seen enough women who become passive aggressive in a way because people don't notice certain things they're doing or don't, but the guys are out there promoting themselves. And unless you take some personal responsibility for being out there, not in an obnoxious way, but making sure people hear you, that's, I think I wish I had thought about that earlier in my life.
Thank you, Marjorie. These are really, really wise words. Irene?
I think not dissimilar from Marjorie, although I'm slightly, you know, came later on the scene professionally. But even then, you know, I was worried about what people would think about me, whether being a bit too pushy or not. I think my advice to my younger self would be more pushy. Don't worry. Just go ahead and do what you think is right. And think less about what others think of you. As long as you are comfortable, do it.
Thank you. That's fantastic advice. And I do want to end up, as we're heading into time, I want to just acknowledge that we have Dr. Ilaria Bodillero joining us from Rome, and Ilaria has been at the forefront of really leading the charge on women's equality in the law. And Ilaria has asked us to just reflect on the importance of support of other women, and how women in the workplace need the recognition of other women and their support to climb the ladder. So I just wanted to share that insight from someone who is also incredibly successful in this space. Tracy, I think you're adding some great ideas about raising up the voice of someone else. You know, we're all in this together. And both of you are also authors. And I know we have some information about your book. So as we close, I am going to do an infomercial for both of you and ask Killian to share some of the details of your books, 2 books that I would strongly recommend. So maybe I can ask each of you to say 1 minute about your books each, and Killian will pull up the titles so that people know where to find them.
Well, mine is easy because it's an easy read, and I didn't do it to sell a lot of books. It's called where is it? There it is. And it's not as dark in some ways. It's meant to be a fast read of ideas and actually 10 lessons that maybe people can apply to their own lives and to what they're doing. And probably if I had to summarize it and go back to Judith's question, I would say my favorite quote in it is that nobody can make you feel inferior without your own consent. And it's an Eleanor Roosevelt quote, but I think it was a guiding principle for me of how I could come forward and really be myself. And my family is so much a part of my life that I'm a lot richer for taking those lessons from home and bringing them to work. I think the company's better for it.
And my book, I think you will see from the picture, I think it's an interesting photo where you see the woman standing behind the man. This book is about poverty and human rights. And as I started writing the book, of course, my main thesis is that poverty is not just about income. It's actually about rights. It's about empowering the poor so that they can determine their own destiny. We can't tell them how to live their lives. As I started writing the book, I realized that there's so much of it was about women, because the face of poverty is very often a woman's face. And yet you will see, as even in this sort of family picture, the woman is behind, but she's the one who has the strength. It's about realizing, helping people to open up their potential, helping women to reach their potential. That's what progress has to be, I think, for going forward. And of course for men as well. But if women do not reach gender equality and have to wait for another 100 years, as we were talking earlier, and so on, imagine what society will lose, what all of us, men and women, will lose. So my book, I hope, there's some very, very inspiring stories there of women that I met around the world and how they took their destiny in their hands and made a difference.
Well, and on this final note, other than thanking you, we do have a final comment from Patrizio Cibili, who was the highest ranking Italian diplomat in the UN system, and someone that I think is a great ally and a great champion for women's rights, who does not have a question, but just an appeal. He is a man, and he wants us to please speed up progress. He wants to see equality in his lifetime. So Patrizio, I think you have given us very clear marching orders, and we will all proceed to do that. As a reminder, we will have the recording of this session available. I know that some of you have been asking about sharing this. We'd be delighted if you could. We also really encourage you to sign up to the APCO newsletter and the various events that we're holding, because we do take pride in the work that we do to support women's equality. It's something that we do as a core value. We do it as a passion. Who couldn't, with these great women leaders around us? But we also have a really interesting program of work coming up over the next couple of months. So please watch this space for other really fascinating discussions in the near future. And again, thank you to both of you as panelists. It was an amazing discussion, and we only wish we had more time. Thanks very much, everyone.
For bringing us together.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.